Hey everyone, this is Carlos, founder and CEO of Product School. And today we have a special guest. Her name is Stefania. Steph, I'm going to need to ask you to pronounce your last name, please.
Yes, I've been in that position before. My name is Stefania Bjarney Olafsdóttir. Olafsdóttir is my last name.
That's amazing.
It actually literally means Olaf's daughter of Olaf.
That's amazing. Thank you. She's the CEO at Avo, which is a really cool analytics company that recently raised some funding. So we're going to cover all of that. But before, I want to learn more about you and kind of your story. I think it's pretty fascinating. I saw in your profile that you've been a teacher, assistant hotel manager, a revenue engineer, a data scientist, and now a CEO. So tell me more about it, please.
Yeah, well, exactly. The journey to being a CEO isn't always straightforward. My background is in mathematics and philosophy. That's what I studied. I was almost going into the hospitality business. I wanted to start a hostel in Reykjavik where bands would come and just rehearse music and prepare for Iceland Airwaves, which is this great music festival in Iceland. And I was super intrigued by that. I was almost also just spent my life on sort of just teaching kids. I'm very personally passionate about how can we make the upbringing of individuals independent of their parents. But then I stumbled into genetics. So I went to do a lot of data science stuff, distributed computing, analyses of correlation between DNA mutation and physical traits, like, cancer and some mutation, or allergies and some mutation, or being an alcoholic and some mutation. Super interesting stuff. And that sort of meant that I was one of very few individuals in Iceland that had, back in like 2012, worked with actual and real data, and not just like fabricated and fake data that you do when you're studying a PhD or a master's or a bachelor's. And then a mobile game blew up called QuizUp, and reached 1 million users in their first 5 days. And they were looking for someone to join the team as a founding analyst to understand why some of the people were like going through an onboarding session and playing 10 games in one sit, and then coming again and again and again every day for like months. And then other people were just like not even completing their email. And sort of understand the difference between those groups and sort of how we might be able to help other people that were interested and intrigued by downloading a game, but then they never got further. Why? What stopped them? So that sort of that joining that company triggered both my sort of mechanical, technical brain doing computer stuff and calculating things and creating models, and also my sort of philosophical brain and being very curious about people and sort of trying to understand what drives people, why products are good, why products are bad for different people. And that sort of was my trigger into the product analytics world, which eventually led to us internally at QuizUp building a lot of internal tools for sort of data quality, data literacy, and data discoverability, which we now solve with Avo today. Avo is the analytics governance platform that allows product managers, developers, and data scientists to collaborate around updating their analytics for every single feature release.
That's really cool, because I remember, well, first of all, your background is fascinating. And for anyone thinking about building a product or starting a company, this is a clear example that, well, you can do it. There's no straight path. Like, everyone will have their own way, and yours is definitely incredible. But going back to the analytics part, I remember back in the day, trying to get data you needed almost a PhD, because there was no easy solution, and it was only like owned by the data team. So as a product person, as a business person, I wasn't self-sufficient. And how are you thinking about solving that problem now with Avo?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I definitely think it's a huge movement. It's a wide shift that's going on in the space. It goes way beyond what we are currently building at Avo, but ultimately, the future is ours. So, but how I see the industry changing is like, way back in like 2010, we started wanting to talk about things like self-serve analytics, where people should actually be able to find information and sort of find access to the questions that they had to answer because of their jobs. And that conversation about self-serve analytics it just has grown, but it hasn't really fully been solved. And I was actually recently having a conversation about this on Twitter, and stumbled upon a blog post that I thought also captured this a little bit well, which is, I think we're just talking about so many different things when we're talking about self-serve analytics. We haven't defined what it means to us. And I think what it means to me is self-serve analytics is you should be able to access the metric that you need to be able to report on week over week or day over day because of your job. You should be able to access that data on your own without help from anyone else. Self-serve analytics does not mean you should have access to any type of data at any given point in time and just be able to make assumptions based on it. I think we're far away from that world, and I think that still sort of makes sense we have to realize that still requires two expertise to come together. It's the domain expertise of the question that you're trying to answer, and then it's the data expertise of understanding the data sets that you're working with and understanding just all of the different sort of intricacies of working with huge data sets and how they might be misleading and all those things, which just comes from experience of working with data all the time, all day, every day.
And that puts a lot of power on the user, in this case, the product manager or other team member who is not on the data team, because now you have to focus obviously on picking the right metric and knowing what you want, but at least you can ask the question and be more self-sufficient. As following up on your term about self-serve data, I think that's really cool. Now, I see a world where we went from pretty much no out-of-the-box solution to probably too many. The market is very crowded with so many analytics solutions, and you mentioned data governance. So I want to understand more about where your product sits in this whole world of analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. So to give you maybe a little bit of a deeper background and a backstory of the QuizUp adventure. So QuizUp eventually, grew to have 100 million users around the world, and it was backed by Sequoia and Tencent. But the team was entirely Icelandic. And we were building this at a time when product analytics wasn't even a concept. When I was Googling how to calculate retention, maybe I found one blog post. There was no Reforge, and there was no product school, and there was no way to just Google this and find out the sort of the right way to do things. So we had to figure that out, but we went through, I think, three key learning points and the data journey of QuizUp. One was this self-serve analytics thing. Nobody was able to answer any question without going through a data expert, any question, because all of the data was really broken and nobody knew where to find it, and it was just so scattered. So you had to be a data expert, no SQL, no Python, no Bash, to be able to stitch together all of these different data sources. And in 2 weeks, you would be able to answer your question counting, how many users did X or something. And it just wasn't a sustainable model. So we wanted to transition over to more of a self-serve analytics model. What that meant is we adopted Mixpanel and Amplitude. Actually, we had both of them. And the idea was that the product managers, the developers, the CEO, the marketing people, they would be able to go into some UI to answer their basic questions, right? We would still be working on, Redshift and some raw data to answer the more in-depth question and do some ad hoc analysis that still required stitching together some data sets. But we would empower the team to go through their self-serve analytics motions for things that we could. That was the first realization. The second realization came around, okay, we still actually, we're helping them do self-serve analytics, but they have like broken fishing poles and like they have no hooks and just everything is broken, so they aren't really fishing anything from the self-serve analytics. And that was because the data was still going in such a terrible way into the tools, into Amplitude and Mixpanel. And that was the birth of what then later became Avo, where we developed sort of rigorous planning processes and schema management for how the analytics events should be instrumented before they would go into tools like Amplitude and Mixpanel. And we developed this concept called the purpose meeting, where we would have a sit down, a data scientist, a product manager, an iOS developer, an Android developer, a designer, and a backend developer. We would kick a feature development process off with a purpose meeting where we would define what is your goal with this feature. How do you want to measure its success? And then after that, we would define what are the data structures that we actually need in order to be able to measure these things. This was a game changer of a process for everyone because it just sparked everyone's interest in wanting to understand how features were doing. It just changed developers' mindset from being like, I just want to get this feature out, over to being like, hey, what needle am I actually trying to move here? And being curious about the old features that they did ship, like how are they doing? And sort of sparked this movement for people wanting to iterate on what they had already shipped because we wanted to measure the success of it and we wanted to move some needles with it. And Avo is sort of that data analytics planning and schema validation tool that product managers and developers use so that they can actually successfully measure the releases of their products. Avo integrates them with the tools like Mixpanel, Amplitude, dbt, BigQuery, all of those data tools that you use so that you can port the schemas that you defined over to there, and then you also have validation that the schemas are actually, they match what you defined.
Yeah, what you said right now describes basically how to build digital products right there. I think we went from a world where you pretty much had to be a visionary and have the idea and then have the engineers build it. And now it's all about using data and listening to your customers and not having the idea, but asking the right question in order to pick that best idea and then build.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. Yeah. And so, and then, fast forward maybe a couple of years later, we had just evolved this so much at QuizUp internally. Like, first of all, we learned that we actually had created this world where, okay, we want to never release our products without proper analytics. And so every time we wanted to release a product, it was just like, so people were so frustrated because they were like, the product is ready, but I haven't done analytics and it's not ready. I haven't validated it. And so we created this new type of bottleneck. Previously, the bottleneck was decisions can't be made because people don't have access to data. Now the bottleneck was like, we can't release product updates because we haven't validated our analytics. And then sort of we moved on to the next step, which is really the third key milestone, which is like, this process of maintaining analytics, schemas, and metrics, that also needs to be democratized. It definitely always needs to have an expert, someone who really understands data, but there can't be like a single gatekeeper. That there's so much discussion about like teams need to have, or companies need to have a data governor. I agree, there's a stage where they have to have a data governor. It's the stage where you're going from data chaos to some sort of a structure. The next step you really need to decentralize that data governance. You have to have like an overviewer, someone who, can help you make sure you're doing the right things. But everyone on the team should be able to understand what is good data. How do I define good data? How do I use good data? So it's all about increasing data quality, data literacy, and data discoverability. And so that's the journey.
Thank you for sharing. And I love what you just said about integrating data or analytics into the overall culture of the organization. Isn't it amazing when you hear someone from the marketing team or support saying, okay, what is the success metric? Like, how are we going to measure this?
Oh my God, that feeling. I remember, that feeling when at first, of course, when we started developing this, it was always like us pounding on the door of product teams like, hey, I heard you were releasing a feature. Can we make sure we measure it? Otherwise the CEO will be really mad at us. But then, once we had sort of done the purpose meeting a few times, eventually, and this was just like, it warms my heart still to think about it. And I still get requests from some of my old coworkers to actually facilitate these meetings. But it turned over to being like, hey, data team, we're about to release this feature. Would you mind facilitating a purpose meeting for us? And then next step was like, hey, data team, we just did a purpose meeting. Here's the output. Would you mind reviewing it for us? And like, that's the beautiful maturity of like, centralized analytics over to self-serve dysfunctional analytics, dysfunctional self-serve analytics over to self-serve analytics, asterisks, the definition of self-serve matters, and self-serve data governance. So that was a very rewarding journey, and I totally relate to that feeling when other people in the team or in the company are just like that feeling when I saw someone have a mixed panel chart open. I was like, what are you doing? What are you working on? Tell me more.
It's also contagious. I think the more data-driven an organization becomes, the more hungry they are to really understand their users. And in a quant way, I'm sure there's also a qualitative aspect that cannot be forgotten. But I think striking the right balance and making sure that this is part of the culture and not just of a specific team can help. And one of the things that you mentioned about creating integrations, I think it's powerful, because now a lot of companies that are more product-led or product-driven, they kind of go through those processes. So there's no need to set up your own data infrastructure. Like, you can kind of piggyback off something like Avo and then make sure that you are, focusing on adding value to your users. So what are some good practices for product teams to set up their own data stack?
Right. I'm actually writing a blog post about this right now, because I literally had, I think, 5 or 6 direct messages on Twitter, Messenger, email, and some, I think, our community Slack about recommended stack. So to make sure, you're asking what is a good stack for data teams, for a product team today? Yeah,
not so much on the tools, but like our audience, we have a lot of product managers right now being fascinated by this, and they'd be like, okay, well, this sounds great, but if I don't have my own data stack today, how can I get started?
Right. So like with so many good questions, the answer is it depends. But the dependency here is, I guess, probably 2 key dependencies. Number 1, where are you now? It really depends on where are you now. And I mean culture-wise and tool-wise. Do you have any data? Do you have no data? Is there buy-in from leadership to make data-driven decisions, or is just everything based on gut, or based on 3-year-old roadmap that nobody really wants to move? And then the other dependency is sort of what is the skill set on your team? Do you have access to analytics engineering? Do you have access to anyone who knows SQL? Do you have access to developers? Like, are you releasing product updates bi-weekly, and the developers would be up for making sure there's analytics along with every single one of those feature releases. So all of these are dependencies that before I would recommend anything, I would always ask questions around this. If I take an example, someone who has no product analytics in place currently, I would say start by choosing a product analytics tool and choosing a single North Star metric for the product that you're building. Let's say you're migrating a newspaper over to being digital. You're doing the digital transformation for a newspaper. And let's say your North Star should be something like weekly reading subscribers or something like that. Like subscribers who are reading articles every week. And then you have a few key inputs into that metric. I would always recommend choosing, like identify that sort of business metric that helps you make better decisions about your product. Identify the inputs that actually drive that North Star metric. And then choose like 2 to 5 max initial events that you want to implement, and just start looking at the data for that and feel how that starts triggering more questions from you. So my recommendation for someone who is, to stitch this whole thing together, my recommendation to someone who is starting, start with a good question and go from there.
Love it. Also, questions, I think is the lifeblood of PMs. We're constantly, I think, asking questions, trying to get to more questions. And actually, there's no straight answer. And I love how you phrase that, because it's a representation of how, in general, people go about problems. There's no black or white solution, right? And trying to dig a little bit deeper before you say what's going to happen, I think it's powerful. Plus, sometimes the decisions change, and maybe what's right for a company today is different than what it is for a company a few months or even years from now. And I think that's okay as well, to keep that open mind and keep getting new inputs and questioning your own hypotheses.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that you identified that. I would not answer the question without asking other questions. I often joke that that is the key responsibility of any good analyst, is to dig deeper when someone asks you a question. Like a good analyst will always answer a question with a question because people never ask you for literally what they want to know. They are trying to understand something. They have in their minds mapped that understanding to seeing some sort of a metric, and then they just ask you about that metric. But you, as someone who's a data expert, you know there are like multiple ways to think about the impact of like that metric. And so like the first question is always like, what are you actually trying to understand? Yeah. So I really like that.
Part of it, I think, is what we try to do in product, which is switching from focusing on the solution to focus more on the actual problem. And really go deep into the problem, because it's so easy to try to narrow down things to a solution and then try to trick our own mind to validate that same question, instead of keeping an open mind to see what it is out there that is influencing that final answer.
Totally. And actually that same thing applies to, I want to maybe add to it, like, you know, where should product managers start if they want to go into analytics? The same thing applies to product management as does to sort of analytics, and where should you start? It's always about like slicing, you know, you have some exciting direction you could take your product into, and there are rarely bad ideas that fall to your table. So your job is just saying no to really good ideas all the time, and just like deprioritizing really good stuff and just arguing for like why you should not do that and why you should do this instead. And a really similar thing applies to analytics as well. Like obviously you have all of these questions that you want to answer with data, but number one, you won't have time to get all of the data instrumented if you don't already have it. And number two, you won't have time to dig into all of the data. So you really need to prioritize what are the most pressing questions that you should start by answering, and then work that as like it's a cycle. You look at your data and you make decisions on your product. But data is...
Sorry, go ahead.
Data is never going to tell you what to build, though. But data can act as a guiding light, along with your gut feeling and along with your qualitative research.
I like that. And like the question that comes to mind as you were saying is, okay, how do you apply that framework to yourself as a CEO? Because I'm sure, in addition to saying no to a bunch of nice initiatives, you're constantly receiving inputs and you have to make certain decisions, and you also don't have all the time in the world to get to a certain level of certainty. So what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly true that, I mean, I've heard, I think it was maybe Marty Kagan or someone along that sort of product school of thought, or Marissa Mayer or someone who was saying like, Google trained up a lot of product managers. You know, I guess you probably know more about this than I do. Around like, I don't know, this probably started around the 2000s, and throughout the 2010 and all the way there, they started these product management training programs. And since then, a lot of these big technical companies have started these training programs because the product manager role has just turned out to be such an important role in the business success. Product is fundamental. Product market fit and like identifying it and fitting your customers to your product is just such an important part of being a successful business today, particularly in the digital world of subscriptions, and all those things. But I think what's interesting is, and this is what I was saying, that I think Marty Kagan said this, there's a high proportion of today's CEOs that started off as product managers because it requires the same sort of pillars of thought. It's you need to obsess about the usability of your product. That's like the end user. You need to obsess about the desirability of your product. That's the market, who wants to buy it. You need to obsess about the engineering feasibility of your product. Like, can we build it? Does it make sense? And then you need to obsess over the business viability of your product. Will someone pay for it? How much? Will that pay up the engineering and development cost and the marketing cost and the customer acquisition cost and all that stuff? And so I think the modern day, at least startup CEO of like a fairly small team in like Google scale or whatever, the role of the CEO is very similar to the role of the product manager. And these are the four things that I obsess over in my company, in addition to, team and financials.
No big deal.
Exactly. So I like these. So my job is, maintain a good vision, build a great team, and make sure we don't run out of money. That's how I see my job.
It's been a pleasure to chat and learn from you. Having a candid conversation to see how you think about your company, how you think about the future of product in general. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Wow, that's a huge question.
Really? I've been asking a lot of questions. I think this one is not that hard.
Well, I mean, it just like leaves the entire world open though. There's no narrowing of the scope. I mean, my focus is like, what more would I want to? Should I talk about the guitar? Should I talk about like a coffee? Should I talk about sourdough bread? It just leaves so many things open. So I'm gonna turn it back to you. What should I want to talk about?
You know what? I think there's beauty in keeping things simple. So I'm sure we can go for hours, but I think this is a good stopover. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was great to be here with you.